Okay, welcome back everyone. So we're excited to pick up our programming after lunch. So next up, we have a panel discussion. And this will be moderated by one of our alums, Lucía Szyman Mulero, who has recently graduated from our Master of Science in Environment and Sustainability Management. I've talked a little bit about this innovative program, but I'll tell you a little bit more. And Lucía is a perfect example of what we're trying to do with this program. So it has this unique perspective of blending both environmental science and business skills together to be able to solve these problems. It's a joint collaboration between the McDonough School of Business, the Earth Commons, and the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. And it's really trying to train leaders in environmental sustainability. So after finishing the program, Lucía has started her role as the Customer Success Lead at Proof, which is a data intelligence platform helping businesses make better sustainability decisions, better sustainability performance, and reporting. So I will just turn to Lucía to join us along with the panelists that she'll introduce. Thanks, Lucía. Let's welcome you.
Welcome, everyone. So as Professor Agrawal noted, we are honored to have a distinguished panel that will focus on the energy transition today. And I will briefly introduce to you our panelists. So first we have Chip Levergood from HASI. He's a leading investor in climate solutions with more than 12 billion worth of managed assets. Chip is responsible for originating, structuring, and executing financing for various types of assets, including grid-connected solar, wind, and battery storage. And Chip brings more than a decade of experience on financing the energy transition. Next, we have Jackie Wong from Natural Resources Defense Council. Jackie serves as the chief visionary and strategist for Council's advocacy to fight climate change and advance clean energy. Jackie is bringing over a decade of experience spanning roles in both the private sector and government. And last but not least, we have Jen Zepeda from Revision Energy, a leading solar energy developer in the Northeast with 20,000 installations. Jen's primary focus is creating accessibility by helping frontline communities navigate the ins and outs of solar and energy storage solutions. Overall, Jen brings a unique perspective in ensuring that the energy transition is equitable. Before we begin, please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists to Georgetown. Thank you. So to kick things off, let me get started on focusing on the financing side of the energy transition. So I would like to hear from you, Chip, from your perspective, what are the most significant barriers or challenges that project developers face when raising capital for renewable energy projects, particularly in the current economic climate?
Sure, yeah. So at HASI, I work with developers to provide debt and equity financing for the projects. So I can kind of speak through that lens of interacting with the developers. I think, especially in the current economic climate where you've had increasing costs of capital, increasing interest rates over the last few years, that combined with the fact that projects have an increasingly long development timeline, that's mostly because siting, zoning, interconnection approval, even supply chain considerations, it just takes several years in some cases to get a project developed. You now have projects that started the development process when capital was a lot cheaper, and they're coming to market and looking for financing and looking for PPAs in a completely different economic environment, and that presents major challenges, and you have a lot of projects that are either having to renegotiate revenue agreements or be put on hold.
Mm-hmm. And going further on the financing side, and if anyone wants to jump in and get in this question, how does the market evaluate and price the risks associated with different renewable energy technologies, such as solar energy versus onshore, offshore wind, and energy storage?
Sure, yeah. So the way we look at a project investment, every project has kind of its own unique risk profile, whether it's wind, solar, or storage. Storage has a little bit more of its own unique risk, just because it's a different type of asset, being both load and demand. But it depends on the market, the specific location on the grid, the types of revenue offtakes, and the credit of the counterparty for that revenue agreement. And when we are looking at a potential investment, we run several different scenarios because we're looking at 30+ year investment terms, and we focus on, okay, if things go a little bit sideways, what are the economics in that scenario? And so if you have a project that has a little bit higher risk based on one of these factors, it just increases kind of the cost of capital that's available to that project.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for those insights into the financing side. And of course, as we all know, financing doesn't just happen in a vacuum. So inevitably, financing is linked to the policy side of the energy transition. So maybe, Jackie, this is a question more for you. There have been significant changes over the last few years, as we discussed earlier this morning. So what do you think are the biggest regulatory or policy impediments currently hindering the energy transition, and maybe how do you think they can be overcome?
Sure, so I'm gonna back up a second. It's really hard to read the news these days without reading some article about data centers fueled by AI that's demanding lots of energy, and sort of a widespread panic around how are we gonna meet this load demand. But I think the reality is that even though this is an obvious trend that is sort of happening more quickly than we anticipated, we've known for a long time that there's going to be a lot of load growth. So very fundamental to our decarbonization policy or plans is electrifying, basically buildings, transportation, certain industrial processes. And when you have all of these new demands for electricity, plus AI-driven data centers and the onshoring of manufacturing, et cetera, the reality is you just need a lot more electricity. So the power sector is going to need to at least double or triple in size, and I think that's not something that we've been in the mindset for in the last few decades when load growth has been really flat. So with that as sort of like the background and thinking about how do we build big things fast and how do we really turbocharge the size of the power sector, and obviously do so in a clean way that also maintains affordability. One of the big things that I think a lot about is transmission. And Chip referenced this with his interconnection queues, but to oversimplify, you have a lot of renewable potential in the open plains of the middle of the country, but how do you get that to the population centers? And our energy system and the regulations and policies aren't really set up for that because we haven't had to be in that mindset to date. So a lot of the permitting of transmission is done at the local and state level, and what we really need now are these huge interstate transmission lines that can cut across the country. And I think figuring out how to change the model so that we can build that and do it in a fast way is going to be really important. And this isn't really a policy barrier per se, but another thing we're seeing, and would love to hear whether Chip and Jen are seeing the same, is there are actually a lot of local opposition that's popping up to renewables projects, which sounds kind of counterintuitive. But I think it's based on misinformation or like what's in it for me or basic NIMBYism. So you've seen hundreds of communities that have set up zoning and land use restrictions to basically effectively prohibit renewables siting. So I think that it's both a factor of changing the game, changing the sort of the rules to allow these big transmission lines to be built, as well as really helping to change the game on the ground so that we're not seeing this opposition to clean energy projects. And in terms of like how to do that, I mean, I think that there is a fair bit on the transmission piece that can be done through existing authorities with FERC and with DOE. Legislation, though, would be a real game changer in terms of unlocking authorities. But I think it's really important to like, when you think about speeding up processes, to not be too broad brush and completely just ignore the important protections that are in place. I think that permitting processes and sort of environmental reviews, they play an important role in protecting communities that have historically not had a voice. And I think there certainly is a role for that, but how can we do things faster without, you certainly don't want to run over those communities and sacrifice them, but we do need to figure out how to do things faster while still being smart. And in terms of the community opposition, I think a lot of this comes down to helping communities understand both understand as well as actually benefit from these projects. So what's in it for them in terms of not just jobs, but also on an ongoing basis from these projects, what's in it for them? And so I think a lot of this is about education and actually making sure that the projects engage with the communities early on so that there are community benefits.
Those are great points. Do you want to add something?
I'll agree 100% because the community should have a voice in the infrastructure that's impacting it. But I'll just say from a very concrete example on interconnection, we have very, robust goals in Massachusetts where I work towards decarbonization, and the siting, permitting, interconnection with the utility is held up. We have all these grid studies happening right now in Massachusetts. It's really holding things up, and there are timelines associated with those studies, and yet the timelines slip. And I have not seen examples really of, you need carrots and sticks, and I'm not seeing the sticks for when those timelines slip and projects suffer as a result. And if we're going to meet those goals, we need to build big and we need to build fast. And with the communities and equity and doing it the smart way in mind.
Definitely, yeah. And now taking a step further and maybe focusing more broadly on the policy side, and maybe Chip, you can comment on this one, but what role do you think that government incentives should play in promoting renewable energy projects at the local, state, and federal levels? And then what type of incentives have proven most effective, or you've seen proven most effective?
Sure, yeah. So, I think government needs to kind of grease the wheels and enable projects to happen, projects that are much needed to support load growth in a clean manner. I think a couple of examples of incentives that have been successful that I see on a daily basis. One is with the passage of the IRA by the Biden administration, kind of expanding and extending several incentives for renewables. I'll focus specifically on the transferability of tax credits. So these are incentives that are available to projects. The transferability provides for being able to effectively sell these tax credits to another party that may not have a direct ownership in the project, and it just kind of broadens the universe of folks that are able to take and monetize these tax credits. It provides more liquidity for the renewable industry in that way. I think another thing I would focus on is community solar programs, which are available in several states and in Washington, D.C., which allow for a connection between kind of smaller grid-connected solar projects and direct to consumers. So this allows individual consumers to subscribe to a portion of the offtake of maybe a 1 megawatt or 500 kilowatt solar project. And it's kind of a win-win because that consumer benefits from first of all, supporting clean energy, but also the cheaper power prices. And the project benefits because they have access to retail power prices, which are higher than the wholesale power that would be ordinarily available to them.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So throughout the day, we talked a lot about financing the transition and ensuring that the demand side works well and that the right policy can enable it. And maybe, Jen, you can tell us how do this aspect intersect with the equitability angle? For example, what types of financing models can be attractive in making sure that low and middle income households can also access the benefits from solar energy?
Sure. So I think there's a lot to unpack in that question. And I think power purchase agreements have been historically a great way for people with who don't have the upfront money to participate in solar projects, which I'm speaking from a solar perspective, so any clean energy project, I suppose. But the maximum benefits do accrue if you are able to outright own. So, we offer at Revision PPAs that you can buy out in the 6th year when the tax appetite of the investor has been satisfied. And I do think that the IRA bonus adders have been a game changer, especially with the elective pay. It's bringing new people to the table and people who've been historically left behind by this transition, so it's an exciting time. And I think there's more, because in the projects that I deal with on a day-to-day basis, I'm seeing things that are very just real, concrete, existing, long-standing problems, like it's affordable housing, but it has like an original roof. Like, you shouldn't probably be doing on-site solar when the roof needs to be replaced. That's just not responsible. Or the split incentive between the owner and the tenant, and how do you get the owner to say yes when the people want it, or vice versa, and how do you just distribute those benefits equitably? So those are the things that we're tackling. And as mentioned in the earlier panels, just the high upfront cost is just a total mind shift for people to wrap their heads around. And when you're coming from an environmental justice neighborhood or a low and moderate income neighborhood, I think that that's a real barrier that we need to start thinking about. So maybe like a lease to own model, or patient capital can be game changers when it comes to that.
And I'd also note that in addition to access to sort of renewables, the energy efficiency angle is really important as well. I think low-income households spend on average 7 to 8% of their income on energy, which is 3 times the amount of non-low-income households, both because their incomes are lower, so the denominator is lower, but in addition because they tend to live in older homes that are more drafty with more outdated appliances. And so not only updating those so that they can support solar panels, for example, but also just doing, getting heat pumps, electric heat pumps into those homes, weatherization, like better windows, better insulation will really help with the equity angle, because, affordability is a huge thing. And if you're spending large amounts of your income on these energy bills, it really hurts wealth building over time and furthers inequity.
Yeah, so I was actually going to ask you about the efficiency for households. That was an important part that we wanted to discuss. So now looking forward, I would like to know how each of you see the roles of your respective organizations, as well as developers and policymakers, evolving in the next 5 to 10 years to ensure that the energy transition speeds up to the level that we need to fight climate change. So I don't know who wants to start.
Can I pause? Can I give an example of the energy efficiency first before I answer that? I can take it first if you guys want. So just on the energy efficiency thing, in Massachusetts we have this thing called Mass Save, and if you are a ratepayer in an investor-owned utility, which is just basically if you're not in a municipal light plant area, you participate by giving a couple pennies of your bill every month to this kitty that everyone has access to. You do a free home energy assessment, and then it opens pathways for you to get subsidized heat pumps. I live in a triple decker. We got our insulation for 90% off through the Mass Save program. You can get window rebates, those smart thermostats, light bulbs, power strips, all kinds of different qualifying measures. And what we were seeing in Massachusetts was just high adoption of the wealthy families who are hearing about the program and taking advantage of it because they have the resources to. And so I think when you start to think about equity, because that's what excited me about this panel, is the fact that there are people being left behind, and they're the ones who've traditionally been left behind. And so how do you start to address that? I'm aware of a fantastic nonprofit in Massachusetts that's working to pair, for example, non-English speaking households, like let's say it's a Spanish speaking household, with a Spanish energy auditor, who then pairs them with, if they're getting a heat pump, a Spanish speaking installer, so that we're starting to address and get these technologies into the households that may not know about the benefits of Mass Save. And I think that's a really exciting thing. And I think them putting their finger on the pulse of language being a barrier was a big game changer. When it comes to what Revision is doing in terms of our part in the next 5 years, I think what we are seeing most acutely is a huge shortage of electricians. I think our stat is like we need 1 million more electricians to meet our clean energy goals. And that's a lot. And if you think about the existing people who practice the trade of being an electrician, they're aging out, they're retiring. And so one thing that we're actively doing is training up the next generation. We've started a workforce development program It's an apprenticeship, earn and learn. You're with us for 4 years, you're paid, you get on-the-job training, you get your licensure. We have programs to help. We're founded in Maine, so we have a program for new Mainers, people who are new to the state, to teach them about how to interview and just like some basic job skills. And I think that we're starting to like take a step back at the big picture and say, what do we need to get to this goal of this many megawatts installed? And I think the workforce piece is a huge part of that, because if we don't have the workforce to install it, then we're gonna fall short. And then on a personal level, I see a great synergy between solar projects and schools, because schools usually have big flat roofs, which are great for solar, but also it exposes kids to this idea of you could have this type of job, which if it had been me, a kid in central Maine growing up in the 80s and 90s, it would have been maybe changed how soon I got into this line of work. And so I think that that my personal focus is really just making sure that our youth are seeing these opportunities so they can get in that workforce pipeline sooner.
You bring up an interesting point, because I think the language barrier is an important thing in the US. And I think we talked earlier in another panel about taking into account the consumer side as well of the energy transition. And so I'm wondering how this initiative that you talked about to address the language barrier, how that can be escalated and like brought up to the entire country.
Yeah, call Massachusetts. So actually, I believe that one of the 2 big investor-owned utilities in our state has actually hired this nonprofit. They're called All in Energy to go. I think they've been hired for 26 of the gateway communities in our state. I hope I'm quoting that stat right, but to provide these services and other ones related to Mass Save. And I think that that's a very, very replicable model. But you have to have someone who's championing that and keeping their eye on the equitable piece when they're developing these programs, because Mass Save is really cool, but when it comes to actually putting it in practice, you needed that language piece, because it's providing financial incentive, but if you don't understand what it is or how to do it, then you're gonna miss out. So I do think that there are lessons that can be replicated from what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to one of our last questions. So I want to hear from all of you and see how the roles of your organizations, as well as developers and policymakers, is evolving in the next 5 to 10 years to ensure that this transition speeds up to the level that we need to fight climate change.
So I can chime in.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think when you think about it, what we are talking about when we're talking about getting to net zero by 2050 is a really, really fundamental transformation of our economy. And I think that there are a few important pieces that have to go into that. And I'm going to step back. I'm not going to talk about specific policies because I think it's more fundamental than that. First of all, I think that we need to make sure that clean technologies are basically cost competitive. There's only so far that like asking people to do the right thing will get you. And so it's about whether it's through incentives or learning by doing, it's really important that we get down those costs. That's number one. Number two, I also think that it's really important that we give people, we basically build coalitions with a large set of stakeholders that all want to see a clean future. And part of that is by giving them a sense, in the case of like a general public, what's in it for them. So, you know, your average person does not wake up in the morning worried about decarbonization goals for 2050. They worry about things that impact their day-to-day. And we're seeing this in the campaign a lot, right? So how can we frame a clean energy future in terms of health, or in terms of jobs, or in terms of their pocketbooks? I think that'll be really important. Plus partnering with all sorts of different, developers or otherwise that have the same general goal so that we can build power. And then third of all is building off a bit of what Jen said. I think that it's really important to think about the communities and the workers that have historically really relied on fossil fuels. And we can't be leaving behind huge swaths of our country. It's not a way to improve the politics in our country. So we really need to be thinking about how do we work with these workers and communities so that they can see a future for themselves in a clean energy economy.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. I think following that, there's a few things that I would just continue to emphasize. I think Jackie mentioned transmission earlier. I think that is so crucial and such a big risk when we're looking at projects in terms of congestion between supply and demand, and also in terms of these queues of just getting generation online in order to support the accelerating load growth that we're seeing, and all that on an aging transmission infrastructure that, there's just not really the right incentives in place and the right policies in place to be able to build up that infrastructure fast enough to keep up. I think with respect to developers, both of you hit on this, community outreach, stakeholder engagement is extremely important, building up the workforce, like you said, and also engaging with government on every level, local, state, federal. I think that's hugely important, especially developing kind of the lobbying heft that is necessary to fight with competing interest groups in Capitol Hill. And then with respect to kind of my organization, HASI, and me specifically, continuing to provide cost-effective capital to developers who are doing the hard work developing projects, and continuing to look at and finance other technologies and other areas. So we're looking at ecological restoration, we're looking at fleet electrification. I think as we finance energy storage, but as long duration energy storage, such as hydrogen can kind of fill that gap, or other technologies. All of these technologies are kind of one piece of the puzzle, and I think you need investors that are going to be willing to provide financing across the board to achieve our goals.
Absolutely. Jen, do you want to comment on your organization as well?
I think the biggest part of it for me was the workforce development piece, but see if there's anything. Oh, yeah, I do. This is why I brought these notes. So recently we've also we have a mission statement of making life better by building our just and equitable electric future. Just and equitable aren't just words that we want to skim over. We need to start really tackling how do you do these harder projects that are just as worthy, if not more so, for communities that can benefit from them. So we recently created an internal team inspired by the federal funding mechanism. It's called the Revision Energy Solar for All team. I'm part of it. And we are growing our expertise in the Inflation Reduction Act bonus adders that kind of tip the scales and make these projects pencil. And just really trying to be good, trusted partners to these people who are putting their faith in us and helping them get their solar installed. So I think that's the projects are probably, compared to the other ones, maybe potentially smaller or potentially harder, but just as worthy, if not more so. So I'm really excited to be a part of that initiative.
That's great to hear. So we've covered the policy, the financing, and the equity side. So I think we're going to open the floor for questions. If anyone has questions for our panelists, you can use the microphone over there. Yeah.
Hui Jackson. So you're probably aware of the recent OATT, Open Access Transmission Tariff in California. It got approved by FERC. So basically, they're going to select the projects based on, it's a scoring system, like the project, the readiness, utility resource planning, procurement process, and also the state goals. So which mean all the transmission availability. So some developers argue like, well, this is the end of open access. But then others said that this is a great approach because then you can really cut off the backlog. And other ISOs may well copy the same tariff. So I want to hear what's your perspective, especially given your, some of the community project development.
I'm actually not familiar with this tariff.
Yeah.
I cannot speak to this question because I work specifically in Massachusetts and my company is New England. I'm sorry, I can't speak more to it. I don't know if anyone else can.
Yeah, sorry.
Probably not the right.
But I'm going to look into it.
What a weird hype for this. Hi, I'm a fellow Massachusetts resident. Yeah, represent. My family actually has solar panels on their roof right now, so also love that.
All right.
And so with that being said, though, in full transparency, I'm coming from an upper class household, and so speaking to your work with increasing equity and equality in solar access, I feel like a lot of times the argument for why people are hesitant to invest in solar, whether it's commercially or within their own homes, is, and fully putting aside the whole like political ramifications or implications, but just the general cost. A lot of times people don't love the argument that, oh, well, like it eventually pays off, in the long run, because, in 2 years, your energy bill may be significantly lower, if not just null. And so with that in mind, what exactly is the argument you use and how to convince people in general to invest in solar regardless of economic class? And then also more specifically, what does it look like to increase equality and equity in the solar industry?
Okay. So I think to expand equity and accessibility is just about making sure that everyone has access to the same technologies and the benefits that those technologies bring. And I think probably getting there is maybe a financial mechanism or an incentive of some sort. The first part of your question was, remind me.
Yeah, now I'm forgetting it myself, but goldfish brain. But essentially, just kind of more specifically, what does that look like? Like, what are the practices that are put in place to increase equality in that, rather than just saying, like, it's a goal that we have?
Yeah, I think it comes down to knowing your audience, and there are lots of different buttons you can press to make an argument. Solar increases the property value. It increases the amount of money you can borrow. It reduces your operational costs. It becomes a publicity or marketing PR benefit. Like, there's lots of different things. I work in the commercial world, so I'm less familiar with the residential, but I think renewable energy is here, it's good, and it's just about getting to know who you're talking to, because it should work for everyone.
To just the Massachusetts person, but you guys are great too.
Hello. So I'm gonna go back to the data center stuff. I have some questions on that, and just kind of like the extent you see renewables playing in like the creation of these large data centers all of a sudden. So, I mean, a lot of these companies had big decarbonization goals saying they're gonna be net zero by a certain date, but then these have been kind of gone like thrown out the window while this race to AI is happening. So I'm kind of curious on like the extent you see, like how ready are renewables to really play in this like race to build all these data centers, and especially with a lot of these companies diversifying their interest in other power grid, or like ways of fueling their power grid with getting like nuclear involved again. And yeah, just looking on your guys' insights on that.
Do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So maybe I'll start by saying there are different kind of levels of data centers in terms of their load profile, where certain types of data centers are kind of constant load, and certain have a little bit more flexibility in when they are pulling from the grid and when they're not. Maybe one extreme example is a Bitcoin mining operation where they can kind of flip the switch on and off. And so pairing that with a wind project, for example, might make a lot of sense, because you can turn on your load when the wind is blowing and benefit from cheap power. I think more of like a constant load data center, which is I think probably what we're more talking about here. Renewables are obviously an intermittent resource, and so that's where energy storage and short and long duration energy storage really comes in order to fill that gap. And so I think there needs to be right now either a higher upfront capital cost to install that, or you see developers that have a broad portfolio of storage and renewable generation assets that are actually able to combine that to provide more of a level kind of generation profile to match the load. And so having these developers continue to build out, I guess, balanced portfolios, if you want to call it that, will help support the data center build out. if you have a grid that can support it.
I think we can wrap up here, and we're out of time, right? Okay, so please, everyone, help me thank the panelists for their time today.